Hi, welcome to Module 2. We'll be covering Chapter 20 and 22 in our textbook in Mounts. In Chapter 20, Mounts introduces the concept of verbal roots. And so when we talk about how a verb is formed, the root of a verb is considered to be its most basic form from which all stems are made in each of the tenses, whether it's the present tense, the future, the imperfect, the aorist, and so on. And right now, we've learned the present tense, the future tense, the imperfect, and in this module, we'll be introducing one type of aorist form called the second aorist. And the verbal root is our starting point for how we form the forms of the verb in all these tenses. And so if I were to describe the process, we first begin with the root. The root becomes the basis of the stem. And we often see this stem in what we call the lexical form. And from this stem in the lexical form, we form all the other tenses. Now the nice thing is, for a verb like luo, and I'll go ahead and write luo here, the stem lu is the same thing as the verbal root. And that's pretty much how we've been using the verb forms. We've been assuming that in the lexical form, when we see the stem, by dropping the omega, we've operated on the assumption that the stem that we see is also the same as the verbal root. And this is indeed the case for most of the verbs that we've been introducing so far. But not all Greek verbs function this way. In fact, a number of verbs have a stem that's different from the verbal root. So if I were to take, for example, a word like didasko, let me write it here actually, didasko, whose present stem is didask by dropping the omega, and this is the lexical form. It actually has a verbal root, didag or didak, and I'm going to use this square root mathematical sign as a shorthand for a verbal root. It actually has a verbal root that is prior to the formation of the lexical form. So you actually begin with the verbal root and it changes into this lexical form for the present tense. So let me clear the board and just remind ourselves of this rule that most of the time the root and the stem are the same, like with a verb like luo, but for some verbs the root may undergo modification and turn into a stem that looks different from the original root for a given tense. And that's usually the present tense, or what we call the lexical form. In this next slide, I try to chart out how the different verbal roots and stems are attached to different tenses. So again, we're used to seeing where the stem and the root are the same, as in the case of luo. And so regardless of the tense, whether we use the present tense or the imperfect tense or the future tense, we assume that luo is the stem in which we use to form all these tenses. But what happens when the present tense stem does not equal the verbal root? They're different. So for example, if with the word didasko, if I add omega here, where the stem is didaksk, that this present tense stem or this lexical form, it's different from the verbal root didag. What is the rule that we use to know which stem or verbal root that we begin with to form a given tense? Well, it's fairly simple. When the verbal root and the lexical form are not the same, when they're not the same, then you use the lexical form for the present tense and for the imperfect tense. And you use generally the verbal root for all other tenses. So again, one more time. If you have something like didask, remember didask means I, and this is the stem, for the lexical form stem for I am teaching, you will use didask for the present tense and the imperfect tense forms. And then you will be using didog, and some textbooks actually use the word didac. This is a hypothetical form, so either one works. But let's use didog, since that's the one I have here on the PowerPoint. Didog, this verbal root, will be used for all other tenses, so the tenses that are not the present tense and the imperfect tense. So if you see didask being used here, notice that you have didask being used for the imperfect and for the present tense, but you have didog here being used for the future. You'll have didog here being used for the aorist, and when we learn the perfect tense, you will have didog being used for the perfect tense as well. So let me clear the board and let me just go over a couple other verbs where the verbal root and the lexical stem are not the same. And so we have another example, ginosko, which is I know. And notice that the ginosk is being used for the present and the perfect stem, but the verbal root for ginosko is gino or gina. Some textbooks use the short omicron, but the omicron almost always goes long. So we'll just use gino. And we have gino here being used for the future. We have gino here being used for the aorist, which is a form that we're going to be learning soon. And when we learn later the perfect tense, it will also use the form gino. So again, when do you use the lexical form when it has a different verbal root? It's going to be for the present and then for the present and the imperfect tenses. And for the verbal root, it's going to be used for all the tenses, including the future, the aorist, and the perfect. This next chart is a bird's eye view of the entire verb system. And Mounts actually has a system of 7 verb types, but I've reduced them here to 3 types just to make it simpler for you. And I'm going to draw a line here showing the 3 main types. The 3 types have subtypes, A, B, C, D, etc. And the ones that you're most used to is type 1, where the roots are not modified, where the verbal root and the lexical stem are one and the same. So you notice that the verbal root lu is the same as lu for the lexical stem. And the same thing with akuo, same thing with contract verbs like poeo, same thing with many of the verbs that are stops like blepo, and same thing with certain types of liquid nouns like meno. And by the way, a liquid verb is one whose stem ends in a mu, a nu, a lambda, or a rho. If the stem ends with one of these letters, it's called a liquid verb. So there are some liquid verbs and verbs with stops that are type 1 verbs where the verbal root and the lexical form, lexical stem are the same. But type 2 is what you've been introduced to some verbs, and you're going to be introduced to a lot more of them for this module, where the roots are regularly modified. In other words, the verbal root and the lexical stem are not the same. And so we have some stop verbs like baptizo and doxazo, and this is a word that you haven't seen yet, tarasso, but you will learn it. Those verbs that are stop verbs, they end in a velar or a dental or bilabial. Some of them have verbal roots that are different, so these are different, they're not the same. Some verbal roots are a simple difference of the verbal root having a single last ending consonant, while the lexical stem doubles that consonant. A lot of liquid verbs modify their stem. A lot of times it's just an insertion of an iota. And then there's some verbs that have actually a drastic stem change. Apothon is the verbal root, and notice that's the verbal root for apothenesco, which is I am dying, I die. Notice that that's a drastic stem change, so you have some of those. Gnosco, which is I am knowing, and its verbal root is gno. And then we have some unusual verbal roots. Sometimes like kaleo, you've learned this from last semester, that it's not a true contract verb. It looks like a contract verb, but actually its verbal root is this digamma here, and that affects the forms for those that use the verbal root. So, and so on. And some of these other ones we haven't learned yet. Lastly, the toughest verbs to learn are the ones that have more than one verbal root. So yes, there are words that have more than one verbal root. So what's interesting, for example, with horao, which means I am seeing, it has hora as a verbal root, but also opt, like in optometry. And so it uses opt for the future form, where it uses hurrah for the present form. And for those verbs that have different verbal roots, the verbal root is not the same. For verbs that have a different verbal root, you're simply going to have to memorize which verbal root to use for which tense. And that's what makes type 3 the hardest. As I clear the board and conclude this section of verbal roots, I'm going to remind you more than once to turn to 177. So that's 177 in your textbook and Mounts. And at 177, you'll have a list up until chapter 20 of all the Greek verbs you've learned so far, plus the verbal roots. So Mounts puts it all in one page. And then from chapter 20 onward, whenever you learn new vocabulary, for example, in our next module, we'll cover chapter 22. You'll have to look at the vocabulary list. You have to see if the verbal root's the same, and if it's different, you want to memorize the verbal root along with the lexical form for your vocabulary.